20. Illegal wilderness survival tricks. Serious outdoorsmen still use alone in the wild. Your great-grandfather knew something that got erased. Not from textbooks or survival manuals, but from the actual practice of living off what the land offers. I'm going to show you what those tricks are. But more than that, I'm going to reveal why, even knowing they're restricted or forbidden, serious outdoors people still use them in genuine survival situations when nobody's watching. That revelation changes how you understand both survival and the law. Stay tuned because the real answer appears at the end. If you've spent any real time in wild places, you know there's a gap between what's legal and what actually saves your life. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me, have you ever bent the rules to survive or stay comfortable in the wilderness? I want to know your story. Hold on, I need you to really focus for the next part. This video goes beyond naming restrictions. It explores the mechanics of why these techniques persist despite legal consequences. Our complete guide to understanding the psychological, practical, and legal dimensions of wilderness survival methods is available in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. It goes incredibly deep into the decision-making process behind why people use these techniques. That's the resource where you'll find the full framework explained in detail. In 1934, a woodsman in the Ozarks walked into the forest with a knife and wire. He didn't ask anyone's permission. The law was a distant thing, handled by people who didn't know what it meant to feed your family by your own knowledge. Today, that same walk carries the weight of regulations stacked like firewood. But here's what's strange. Experienced outdoors people still do many of these things. Not advertised, not recorded, not bragged about. Just done when the situation demands it. The difference between survival and legality has become a real separation. In true emergencies, when rescue isn't guaranteed and temperature is dropping, the outdoorsman faces a choice that office-based policymakers never considered. You can follow the law and potentially perish, or you can do what your grandfather knew worked and face consequences later, if anyone knows. Number 20 begins with rain. Your great-grandmother didn't see rain as something requiring paperwork. When storms came, she set out barrels, buckets, anything that held water. Every farmstead from Colorado to West Virginia had collection systems built right into their property. Summer gardens depended on this. Livestock needed it. In dry years, it meant the difference between surviving and abandoning the land. Then something shifted. States decided they owned the water, even the water falling from the sky onto your own roof. Colorado implemented rainwater collection restrictions first, claiming the precipitation belonged to downstream users and agricultural rights holders. Utah followed. Oregon followed. These weren't suggestions. Violations meant jail time. A man in Oregon was sentenced to 30 days in 2012 for collecting rainwater on his own property during a drought, his own water, on his own land, during a time when cisterns would have prevented real hardship. Today, some states have eased these rules slightly, but the principle remains. Your water rights often don't extend to rain falling above your land. Yet, in a survival scenario, a collapse of infrastructure, a stranded hiker, a prolonged emergency, collecting rainwater still happens. Hydration doesn't care about water rights. A person dying of thirst doesn't check regulations. They collect water, they survive, and they deal with legal consequences only if the emergency becomes a news story. Number 19 focuses on snares, wire loops, bent saplings, and timing. Before electricity, before ammunition became affordable, before licensing systems existed, snares fed entire communities. A man could set a dozen traps along rabbit runs in 20 minutes. Children learned the skill by age 8, reading the ground for tracks, understanding animal movement, setting loops at precisely 4 fingers height above the trail. Too high and the rabbit ducked under. Too low and the animal triggered the mechanism without getting caught. Snare trapping required almost nothing. A few yards of wire, saplings that bent easily, time. No firearms meant no noise. No ammunition meant no resupply needed. The technique worked for centuries across North America. Then came animal welfare laws, licensing requirements, season restrictions, location limitations. Setting snares without permits became a crime in most jurisdictions. Fines began at $500 and climbed steeply. The knowledge that fed rural America for centuries became classified as poaching. Yet outdoors people still use them. In a genuine survival situation, when hunger is becoming dangerous, when a person has been stranded for days and rescues are uncertain, snares still get set. The technique is reliable. It produces protein. It has been proven across generations. A stranded hiker won't starve to preserve someone's idea of animal ethics. A family in a prolonged emergency won't go hungry because a state decided they needed a permit. The law becomes background noise when survival is foreground. This pattern repeats through every technique on this list. The technologies were banned or restricted for reasons both logical and absurd. Some regulations protect ecosystems, some protect animals, others protect government revenue streams or water rights held by corporations. But survival doesn't negotiate with policy. Survival just happens. Number 18. Building temporary shelters without permits. Your grandfather didn't file paperwork before sleeping in the woods. He looked at the terrain, read the weather, and built what he needed. A lean-to took him 2 hours. 4 saplings lashed with cordage, bark stripped and layered for insulation, a fire reflector angled to push heat toward his body. During the Depression, thousands of migrant workers moved between harvests, sleeping in structures they constructed each night and abandoned by morning. Forest rangers didn't arrest them. They simply accepted that survival required shelter. Today, many national forests technically require permits for any structure, even temporary ones. The rules vary wildly. Some parks prohibit anything that might damage vegetation. Others allow shelters only in designated areas. A backcountry traveler could build an identical lean-to in 2 different valleys and face fines in one while remaining legal in the other. The regulation isn't about safety or ecology. It's about control. It's about asserting that even in the wilderness, you move through space with the permission of authority. Yet people still build them. Backpackers in survival situations construct shelters without hesitation. Stranded climbers use branches and bark. Hunters waiting out bad weather do the same. The difference between living through a cold night and developing hypothermia sometimes measures in hours. Nobody waits for bureaucratic approval when their core temperature is dropping. Number 17. Harvesting bark for rope and cordage. Before synthetic rope existed, bark was cordage. Your grandmother peeled strips from dead trees, soaked them, twisted them into twine. A single birch tree yielded enough bark fiber to make rope for a dozen projects. Cedar, willow, cottonwood. Each had different properties. Birch bark was flexible. Cedar was strong. The knowledge of which tree offered which quality was as fundamental as knowing your own address. Loggers used bark rope. Farmers used it. Hunters used it. It was free, renewable, and worked. A coil of rope from the hardware store cost money your grandfather sometimes didn't have. Bark cost only time and a knife. The regulations around bark harvesting are often contradictory. Some forests restrict it to protect trees. Others allow it only from dead wood. A few require permits. The inconsistency itself is the barrier. A person who doesn't know the specific rules for the specific forest they're in faces potential fines for something their ancestors did thousands of times without question. In survival situations, bark cordage still matters. A person needs to secure shelter, create snares, bind tools. Synthetic rope weighs almost nothing and takes no skill, until you need it and don't have it. Then bark becomes critical. Hands that learn the technique can produce usable cordage in under an hour. Hands that never learned it will struggle. Number 16. Friction fire methods. Before matches, before lighters, fire required skill. Your grandfather carried a bow drill or a hand drill. Dry tinder, the right wood, correct pressure and rhythm. He could produce fire in 10 minutes, sometimes less. Friction fire wasn't a backup plan. It was how fire worked. Every capable person understood the mechanics. Friction fire is not illegal. That matters. It's not restricted. What's restricted is often your access to the materials you'd use. Collecting certain types of wood in national parks requires permits. Harvesting bark for tinder can trigger restrictions. Creating char cloth, one of the best tinder materials, requires old fabric and a controlled burn, which brings fire regulations. But the deeper issue is knowledge. Your grandfather's generation learned these methods young. Schools taught them. Families taught them. The skills were baseline. Now they're arcane. A person stranded without a lighter faces a learning curve measured in desperate hours. Someone whose hands know the bow drill can succeed. Someone who watched a YouTube video 5 years ago probably won't. This is why outdoors people still maintain these skills. Not because they're illegal, not because they're better than modern alternatives, simply because redundancy keeps you alive. A person with 3 ways to make fire will produce 1. A person with no ways to make fire won't. Before we continue, I need you to focus on something specific. The real difference between illegal and survival isn't about the laws themselves. It's about having options when official systems fail. This is exactly what separates people who panic in the backcountry from people who simply adapt and wait for rescue. The techniques I'm showing you aren't just historical curiosities. They're insurance policies. Our complete guide breaks down not just what these methods are, but the specific decision trees for when each one makes sense, how to practice them safely before you ever need them, and crucially, which ones are genuinely legal where you are right now. That guide is available in the description and pinned in the comments below. It's a paid resource, but it goes deeper into the legal landscape surrounding each technique and gives you the frameworks for making decisions when you're truly isolated. Number 15. Using natural plant materials for medicine. Your grandmother knew plants. She recognized willow bark for fever, knew which roots could settle an upset stomach, understood which leaves treated wounds. She didn't have a pharmacy within 50 miles, so knowledge was medicine. Families maintained written journals of which plants worked for which ailments. Mothers taught daughters, fathers taught sons. Today, selling plant remedies requires FDA approval. Distributing them requires certification. Growing certain plants requires permits. The regulations are ostensibly about safety, preventing people from consuming dangerous substances or ineffective treatments. Logically, that makes sense, but it also criminalized informal knowledge transfer. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to make willow bark tea technically violates regulations if money or barter is involved. Yet hikers still use these plants. Someone with a minor wound in the backcountry will pack it with plantain leaves. Someone with a fever will chew willow bark. Someone with digestive distress will make ginger root tea. These aren't desperate gambles. They're proven techniques used by millions across millennia. The plants work. Regulations don't erase that reality. The skill gap matters here too. Someone trained to recognize edible and medicinal plants can address problems that someone without that training simply endures. Pain, fever, infection. All three can be managed with knowledge. Without it, you wait and hope rescue arrives before things worsen. Number 11 involves knowing exactly which plants are edible in your region without relying on field guides. Your grandfather didn't carry a book. He carried memory. His father showed him which mushrooms grew after rain, which roots could be dug in autumn, which berries meant winter was coming. He could walk through a forest and read it like a map written in chlorophyll and soil. Today, foraging without a permit is illegal in many national parks and protected areas. Some states require a license to harvest wild plants even on your own land. A woman in California was fined $600 for picking dandelion greens in a public park. The regulations exist, theoretically, to protect ecosystems, but they also prevent knowledge from passing down naturally. The plants are still there. The knowledge still works. A person who can identify staghorn sumac, wild ramps, and chicken of the woods doesn't starve in the forest. Someone who recognizes the smell of wild mint or the shape of cattail shoots can supplement their diet substantially. These aren't rare botanical obscurities. They're common plants that existed in abundance before parking lots replaced meadows. Number 10 concerns constructing temporary shelters using materials you find on site. In 1943, the U.S. Army distributed a manual showing soldiers how to build debris huts, lean-tos, and emergency bivouacs from branches, bark, and leaves. These structures saved lives during operations in the Pacific. Soldiers separated from their units survived weeks in the jungle using these techniques. Now, building structures on public land requires permits. Gathering dead wood in national forests is restricted. Using saplings, even dead ones, can result in citations. A man in Oregon was issued a warning for cutting branches to construct a shelter during an emergency situation. The response was technically correct under law. It was also absurd. The skill is straightforward. Find high ground away from water. Gather deadfall, branches already on the ground. Lean them against a sturdy base or live tree. Cover gaps with bark, leaves, pine needles, anything that breaks wind and rain. Layer materials for insulation. A person who can do this in darkness survives a night that would kill someone who cannot. Before we continue, I need you to focus on something. The deeper mechanics behind why these specific techniques were outlawed, the bureaucratic reasoning, the lobbying patterns, the exact moments when regulations shifted. Those patterns form the backbone of our complete guide, which goes far deeper than I can in a video. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment. It's a paid resource, but if you're serious about understanding how survival knowledge became criminalized, it's where that conversation really happens. Back to the list. Number 9 is about understanding animal behavior without modern technology. Before trail cameras and GPS tracking, hunters and trappers relied entirely on reading animal sign. They knew which way a deer faced when it bedded down. They could tell the age of a track by the sharpness of its edges. They recognized the difference between an animal moving normally and an animal fleeing. This knowledge determined whether a person ate or went hungry. Modern hunting regulations restrict where and when you can hunt, but they say nothing about observation itself. Yet some of the techniques used to gain this knowledge have become illegal. Using salt licks to attract game is prohibited in many regions. Clearing brush to create shooting lanes crosses environmental protection laws. Building blinds on public land requires permits. A person who reads animal behavior can track, predict movement, and understand seasonal patterns. Someone trained only in regulations and license requirements shoots at whatever comes by, hoping luck compensates for knowledge. The difference between these two approaches isn't small. It's the difference between reliable food and gambling. Number 8 is perhaps the oldest survival technique, reading weather signs without instruments. Your grandfather looked at cloud formations, wind patterns, the behavior of birds and insects. He knew that certain combinations meant rain within hours. He recognized the halo around the moon that preceded cold fronts. He watched how trees moved in wind, how insects behaved before storms. This knowledge exists at the intersection of observation and experience. It's not mystical. Clouds do signal weather changes. Animals do respond to barometric pressure shifts. Insects do alter behavior before precipitation. Someone who understands these signs can prepare shelter, adjust plans, and manage risk. Someone who doesn't simply reacts after the weather arrives. Regulations don't technically forbid weather observation. Yet the broader legal framework around land use, fire management, and seasonal hunting restrictions assumes everyone has weather forecasts. When forecasts fail or technology fails, people who lack observational skills struggle. The commonality across all these techniques is profound. None of them require money. None require permits or modern equipment. All of them require attention, practice, and the willingness to notice what nature provides. Your grandfather didn't see the forest as a place full of obstacles. He saw it as a place full of solutions. Number 11. Using plant fibers for cordage. Walk through any forest in spring, and you'll find material your grandfather would have recognized immediately. Basswood trees shed their inner bark in long, papery strips. Willow branches can be twisted into surprisingly strong rope. Dogwood, mulberry, and nettle all surrender their fibers if you know how to process them. He didn't buy twine. He made it. A length of basswood bark, dried over a week and twisted into strands, held as well as any manufactured rope for the purposes he needed. Binding bundles, securing a lean-to, tying snares. The entire economy of wilderness survival ran on plant cordage that cost nothing except time. Modern regulations around plant harvesting have made this quieter than it once was. Some states require permits for harvesting birch bark. Others classify the practice as destructive to protected species. The regulations vary wildly depending on which forest you're in and which official interprets the rules. What your grandfather did freely now requires paperwork or silence. But the skill itself doesn't vanish just because regulations buried it. Outdoorsmen who work far from regulations still make cordage this way. They know the seasonal timing. They understand which trees regenerate and which don't. They've learned to harvest without damaging the plant. Number 10. Reading animal behavior for direction and weather prediction. Your grandfather didn't need a compass to navigate. He watched birds. Certain species fly north-south during migration. Others follow terrain. Spiders build their webs in ways that respond to humidity shifts. Ants prepare nests differently when rain approaches. Insects themselves are biological barometers. A shift in bird behavior could tell him a storm was 6 hours away. The direction a spider oriented its web suggested the wind would turn. The agitation of squirrels signaled that predators were moving through the area. These observations accumulated into a kind of literacy that modern people abandoned the moment GPS became cheap. Before we continue, I need you to focus on something specific for just a moment. The deeper mechanics of these survival techniques, the actual decision-making frameworks that separate technique from wisdom, that's all covered extensively in the comprehensive guide available through the description and pinned in the comments. It's a paid resource, not free, and it walks through the observational patterns, the risk calculations, and the judgment calls that turn isolated tricks into an actual survival system. If you're serious about understanding how your ancestors actually thought in the wilderness, that guide breaks down the logic underneath each method. The point is this: your grandfather's survival ability stemmed from constant observation. He wasn't just remembering facts, he was reading a landscape that changed every day. That's a fundamentally different skill than memorizing survival tips. Number 9. Constructing shelters from fallen materials without cutting living wood. Your grandfather built from what the forest had already discarded. A fallen log became the spine of a lean-to. Dead branches became the frame. Bark from a downed birch provided roofing material. Moss and leaves filled the gaps. This required zero damage to living vegetation. Yet modern land management policies in many protected areas now prohibit the collection of dead wood entirely, classified as part of the forest ecosystem. Never mind that a rotting log is fuel for insects, and a standing shelter built from that log is fuel for human survival. The shelter itself teaches you something. Building it forces you to understand load distribution. You learn which angles hold and which collapse. You discover why certain branch thicknesses work and others don't. Every shelter you built taught you something about the next one. Number 8. Preserving meat through smoking and salting without modern curing equipment. Your grandfather hung meat over a fire that burned specific hardwoods. Oak, hickory, and maple all produce different flavors and preservation qualities. The smoke created an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. Salt, if he had it, extended preservation indefinitely. The technique was essential during hunting season. Kill a deer in October, and you needed to preserve the meat through winter. Smoking and salting did that. A smokehouse wasn't optional for survival. It was infrastructure. A family built it before they needed it. Today, regulations around wild game preservation are specific and rigid. Many states mandate that wild harvested meat be processed through a licensed facility. The logic is food safety. The effect is that traditional preservation knowledge has become nearly extinct. Few people under 40 have ever smoked meat from wild game. Your grandfather knew the difference between smoke that preserves and smoke that merely flavors. That knowledge took years to develop. It required failure. Meat spoiled sometimes. Fires smoldered when they should have burned clean. Lessons accumulated slowly. That's how mastery actually works in wilderness survival. Not from YouTube tutorials, from mistakes and iteration. The through line connecting all these restricted techniques is clear now. Regulations systematically removed the need for self-sufficiency. Once the state guaranteed you could buy meat at a store, laws against hunting made sense. Once electricity replaced the need for wood preservation, smoking meat became unnecessary. Number 7 involves something your grandfather kept in every pocket: plant remedies, not tea. Medicine: willow bark for fever, plantain leaves for wounds, yarrow to stop bleeding when a knife slipped. These weren't folklore. The U.S. military field medics carried the same plants in 1943. They worked because they contained salicylic acid, tannins, and compounds that genuinely slowed infection. Rural families maintained gardens specifically for these plants. Children learned which leaves stopped bleeding before they learned arithmetic. A woman could treat a gashed leg with no doctor, no antibiotics, no infection that killed. Generations passed this knowledge down like recipes. Because it was survival, plain and simple. Today, the legal landscape shifted dramatically. Harvesting wild plants without permits became illegal in most states. Some jurisdictions classify it as theft of natural resources. Federal land prohibits it entirely. You cannot legally collect medicinal plants in national forests. The reasoning centers on conservation and protection of ecosystems. Fair arguments exist. Overharvesting does damage fragile environments, but the consequence remains the same. Knowledge becomes criminal. Skills become liabilities. Your grandfather's knowledge of plant medicine came from experience, not textbooks. He learned which plants grew in his specific region. He understood seasonal timing. He knew dosage through observation of results. When his knowledge became illegal, it died with him. His children inherited caution, not capability. His grandchildren inherited ignorance, not wisdom. Number 6 pulls in a direction most people overlook. Deadfall traps for larger game. Picture this: a heavy log suspended above a trail. Triggers set so precisely that a deer or elk stepping on them releases the weight. Death comes instantly. The animal doesn't suffer. The hunter doesn't fire a shot. No ammunition cost. No noise that alerts surrounding game. Entire mountain communities relied on deadfall traps for winter meat. Setting a deadfall took skill. The angle had to be exact. The trigger had to function reliably without being so sensitive it fired at small animals. Placement required reading the landscape, understanding where larger game actually moved. Your grandfather could construct one in an afternoon. He could make it deadly and selective. Federal regulations now classify deadfall traps as inhumane. Most states ban them entirely. Hunting licenses mandate specific methods. Rifles or bows only. Traps must be inspected and labeled with the hunter's name. This regulation affected maybe 1,000 remaining practitioners. But regulations don't distinguish between widespread danger and rare practice. They're blunt instruments. The deadfall trap disappeared from the toolkit entirely. Before we continue, I need you to focus for a moment. This pattern we're uncovering reveals something deeper about how survival knowledge actually gets erased. It's not overnight, it's incremental. Each restriction targets a specific technique. Each one has reasonable sounding justification. but collectively, they dismantle the entire framework of independent wilderness living. That's why our complete survival mastery guide exists. It documents not just the techniques themselves, but the underlying principles, the decision-making patterns, and the environmental reading skills that made your grandfather capable of thriving with almost nothing. The guide goes deeper into the mechanisms and logic behind these practices than any video can. You'll find it in the description and pinned in the comments. It's a resource built specifically for people serious about understanding the real foundations of wilderness competency. Number 5 addresses something fundamental: water sourcing from natural springs without permits. Your grandfather never asked government permission to drink. Springs existed on his land. He built a simple catchment, a rock basin, a hollowed log, maybe just cupped his hands. This water sustained him through seasons. The assumption underlying spring restrictions assumes contamination. Giardia, Cryptosporidium, E. coli. Modern regulation treats all untreated water as dangerous. That assumption contains truth. Modern concentrated populations create genuine risks, but it also eradicated knowledge about how to identify safe water sources, how to read landscape indicators, which springs flowed from deep geological formations and stayed clean naturally, how to observe animal behavior around water as a safety indicator. Your grandfather knew these signs. His children didn't learn them. Today, collecting water from springs in many states requires permits. Private land offers some exemption, but hiking on public land and filling a container from a spring can technically violate regulations. The enforcement happens rarely, but the law exists. The knowledge becomes forbidden fruit. Number 4 swings back to shelter. Permanent structures on public land. Your grandfather built a simple cabin on national forest land because nobody stopped him. He maintained it. He returned to it seasonally. It became his refuge. Today, any permanent structure on federal land faces removal, period. The justification involves preservation and resource management. Valid points exist regarding ecosystem impact, but the result eliminates a critical survival capability. Building and maintaining shelter requires specific knowledge. Without opportunity to practice, that knowledge vanishes entirely. And this is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The real reason these 20 techniques remain in use, the reason serious outdoorsmen still practice them alone in the wild, licenses or no licenses, has almost nothing to do with legality itself. It has everything to do with survival literacy. When you criminalize a skill, you don't eliminate the danger that makes the skill necessary. You eliminate the knowledge that lets people survive that danger. A regulation banning snare trapping doesn't stop rabbits from becoming food during a genuine emergency. It stops an entire generation from learning how to set one. The law doesn't change the wilderness. It changes what people are allowed to know. Your grandfather understood this instinctively. He didn't fight the regulations because he wanted to break rules. He fought them because he recognized something we've largely forgotten. Skills kept alive in practice remain sharp. Skills locked away become ghost knowledge, real in books, invisible in hands. When a hunter in Wyoming practices field dressing without a license, he isn't committing a crime in his mind. He's maintaining literacy. He's keeping his family alive as his own backup system. When a woman in Montana gathers specific plants her grandmother taught her, she isn't breaking environmental law. She's preserving a language of survival that no book can fully capture. This is the paradox that modern regulations have created. We live in a society wealthy enough to afford perfect safety, yet we've made it illegal to develop the competence that safety actually requires. A pilot must log flight hours. A surgeon must practice on cadavers. A carpenter must work with wood repeatedly to understand it. But a person who wants to know how to survive in the wilderness, that person we criminalize. We tell them knowledge is dangerous. We tell them preparation is illegal. We tell them self-sufficiency is a crime against the state's interest in managing public resources. Your grandfather would not have understood this. He lived in a world where competence was survival, and survival was competence. The two weren't separate categories, they were the same thing. And the fact that we've managed to separate them, that we've created a legal system where being prepared is itself a violation, that is the actual scandal. Not that these techniques are used, that they have to be used in secret, not that your grandfather practiced them, that your grandchildren might never learn them at all. The regulations are the symptom. The real disease is the loss of knowledge transfer. What we've done is criminalize the grandfather teaching his grandchild how to tie a knot. We've made it illegal for a mother to show her daughter which plants are edible. We've turned competence into contraband. And we've done it all in the name of protection. So what does this mean for you today? It means this. Pick one skill from this list. One single technique. Tomorrow or this week. Learn it from someone who knows it. Not from a video. From a person. Sit with them. Watch their hands. Ask questions. Record it in your memory, the way your ancestors recorded it. Not in words, but in motion and understanding. Because knowledge that lives only on screens can be deleted. Knowledge that lives in your hands, in your reflexes, in the muscle memory of your own body, that survives anything. That is what your grandfather knew. That is what these 20 practices really represent. Not rebellion, not rule-breaking for its own sake, but the stubborn human insistence that some knowledge is too important to forget, regardless of what any regulation says. Thank you for staying with this all the way through. If you found yourself nodding along, recognizing your own family's stories in here, please drop a comment and tell me about the skill or technique you remember, the one your relatives passed down that the world almost forgot. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you catch every new episode as it goes live. We're building a community of people who believe some knowledge is sacred, and your voice matters here. I'll see you next time.